What's the key difference between Baroque music and rock music? Is it drums? No, because Lully and Handel used drums. Is it jazzy rhythms? No, because Bach was quite partial to those. I'll tell you what it is. It's repetition. If an ancient composer has said something once, they'll rarely say it again in exactly the same way, in the same key. However, in pop music, the same material recurs in the same key, the same music, the same words, and it's called a chorus. That said, there are some ancient composers from hundreds of years ago who were truly ahead of their time, and their music can only be described as Baroque and roll. It's not very often that I get to visit a large parish church on my travels, and this is one of the very best in England. St Mary's, Fairford was built in the 1490s, paid for by a wealthy cloth merchant named John Tame, and it remains virtually unchanged since then. 28 windows grace the structure, all of which are the original medieval ones, each a masterpiece. And from the lofty to the small, just outside the door is a memorial to a former church cat, Tiddles. According to the church warden, he spent more time in the church than anybody else, and deserved his own plot. Rightly so. This church possesses the most complete set of medieval glass in the entire country. 28 huge windows survived the ravages of the Reformation, not to mention 2 world wars and half a century of storms. They have been removed twice, once during the English Civil War and again during the Second World War, stored in a cellar for safekeeping. If I were a historian, then this glass might be the subject of an entire video. But instead, as a musician, it forms the perfect backdrop to my performance. The basic difference between an organ like this one and a village church organ is size. Neither instrument was intended to play grand organ works. They were both designed for hymns. However, in a church like St Mary's, you need a larger instrument to fill the space. Some village church organs have none of the spiky sounds, which we call mixtures, and they also don't have reeds like cornopians, trombones, or trumpets. However, in a larger building, you need a more stately sound and more variety. And mixtures and the trumpet can really cut through the sound of a congregation singing, for example. It helps lead them in hymn singing much better. Around the back of the organ you can also see the massive wooden pipes which provide the bass. But otherwise this instrument is very similar to a village church organ. It was intended for accompanying hymns, and in order to warm up before I play my favourite organ piece ever, I decided to play a hymn tune. And this one was easy to choose. There's that little memorial to the church cat Tiddles who lived to the ripe old age of 17 outside in the churchyard. And so there was really only one hymn I could choose. All creatures of our God and King, harmonised by one of Gloucestershire's most famous sons, Ralph Vaughan Williams. Hymns, my friends, are great chunks of notes, each one placed at the same time in a four-square arrangement. And if you can play a hymn on a tiny organ, well, you can probably play it anywhere. The difficulty comes with repertoire music, proper organ music. It's lightning fast and it requires changes of stops midway through playing, not just between verses. Playing organ repertoire is much harder than playing hymns, so it takes me some time to get used to an instrument before I can properly perform an organ piece on it. However, it's time to perform my favourite organ piece ever. This is a piece which inspired me from the age of 14, sat by the fire on a Saturday night, trying to forget about school for a while, and I've loved it ever since. but I've never actually learnt it properly because it's so difficult and it requires so many stop changes during performance that you almost need somebody on your left and somebody on your right to help you out. And here's the most intriguing feature of this piece. It's not actually an organ piece, or rather it didn't start out as an organ piece. In the year 1703, a red-haired violinist was ordained in the city of Venice. His friends would call him Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest, but his heart was always in music. Antonio Vivaldi would go on to compose as many as 94 operas, not to mention more than 500 concertos, and the Four Seasons, which remains triumphant to this day. His genius, virtuosity and driving rhythms became his legacy, not just in Italy, but across the Alps in Germany too. The most amazing part came when a younger composer, at the time he was about my age, heard this music and he thought, wow, I'll have a piece of that. But he wanted to play it all himself. He didn't want different performers playing it. He wanted complete control to play it entirely on his own on the mightiest instrument of all, the king of instruments, the church organ. And his name was Johann Sebastian Bach. He transcribed Vivaldi's music for organ solo, and this was the result. Vivaldi's Concerto in A minor, featuring J.S. Bach on the organ. That is my favourite organ piece, and I can tell you why by showing you the score. There are 3 reasons why it's just a fantastic piece of art, and we have Vivaldi to thank for that, of course. The windows at St Mary's Church are made up of mainly bold primary colours. That's why they're so striking. What are the primary colours in music? Well, there are 3 very important chords. Chord number 1, chord number 4, and chord number 5. Most pop songs nowadays just use those chords. They don't use any other chords. You can write a fantastic pop song out of 3 chords. And Bob Dylan proves that countless times. And that's what Vivaldi does here. If I colour in the score, you can clearly see how much of Vivaldi's music is made up of just 3 chords. But what does he do when he's not using those chords? Well, he uses something spectacular, the greatest chord progression ever invented in music, and it's called the circle of fifths. Each bass note is 5 notes below the last one, and that creates a fantastic chord progression with constant momentum. It's been in use for hundreds of years, and it's still the favourite chord progression to this day. So those are 2 reasons why Vivaldi's music is spectacular in this composition. And I'll tell you a 3rd reason. Simpler than you think. This music is monstrously catchy. And why is it catchy? Because it's repetitive. What differentiates classical music from pop music? Repetition. Yes, of course, classical music is repetitive. It's built on repeating themes and developing themes. But the general motto in classical music is that if you've done something once, don't do it exactly the same again. That is in stark contrast to pop music, where you have a chorus repeated exactly the same each time with the same words. You don't really get that in classical music, but you do get it here, because Vivaldi loves to repeat his themes. Even Bach doesn't do that. He doesn't simply repeat a block of music. Vivaldi does, and that's why this music is so modern, so fresh, so timeless, so spectacular. It's time to perform it in full for you. I told you earlier that recording these kinds of instruments is very difficult, especially in quiet passages. Not only do you have the risk that somebody will come in and accidentally trip over on the step next to where your microphone is placed, but also you hear the mechanics of the organ more in quiet passages, and most importantly in this piece, it's virtually impossible to play them. Not so much the notes themselves, but the registration changes. You would need, as Bach did have, somebody on each side changing the stops to transform the sound of the organ in an instant. I do not have that. So, I have to be inventive. And as I always like to mix the concept of practice and performance in my videos, I have been creative, and I hope you enjoy it. This is Vivaldi's Concerto in A minor. Bach to the Future with Vivaldi's Concerto in A minor. At this point in the video, if you're not yet a subscriber to this channel, then do just click on that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you a penny, but it ensures that you are one of the first to see where my organ eccentricities lead me next. If you'd like to, you can also support me with a small PayPal donation. If you look underneath this video, there's a link there. And if you click on that, it takes you to my PayPal donations page. And from there, you can leave a small contribution if you'd like to help support my work and my travels and my music. Thank you very much indeed. It's amazing to visit so many different churches on this channel, and as I'm walking around these buildings, I'm so often inspired by even the most minute details to play one particular piece of music, for example. And in this church, it was one of the furnishings just behind the organ which inspired my final hymn. All that's left to say is thank you to the vicar, Reverend Caroline, for allowing me to film at St Mary's, Fairford. And I say to everybody watching, thank you so much for joining me on today's trip, and I'll see you next time. Cheerio.